Although toilets go all the way back to the 16th century, they didn't have any on pirate ships. Instead, they had a head, which was really just a plank of wood with a hole cut through it that emptied into the water below. Why was it called the head? Well, the plank was usually located at the bow or the head of the ship. Sailors called the plank by its location on the ship, and the name stuck. In fact, head is still a fairly common term for a bathroom on a ship, and in other locations. Interestingly, Royal Navy ships had proper facilities, but only for officers. The common sailors had heads, just like the pirates. And in bad weather, they probably sometimes used a pot instead of the plank, and then just threw the filth overboard later. Movies like The Pirates of the Caribbean make the pirate life seem like non-stop adventure, but that's just because they leave out all the cleaning. Yep. Pirates spent a great deal of their time washing their ships, inside and out. Decks had to be scrubbed, repairs had to be made, and blades and sidearms had to be cleaned. Every sailor had assigned chores to carry out, and the work was not easy. There was also periodic maintenance. The same way you have to take your car in for an oil change every so often. Every few months, a pirate would have to go find a place to careen their ship. This refers to tilting the ship onto its side, allowing the bottom to be scraped of barnacles and mollusks. The process prevented the ship from becoming infected with shipworm, which are also sometimes known as the termites of the sea.
As longer and longer voyages became more common, sailors started to become afflicted with a strange and horrible disease. It would appear after just a few weeks at sea, and at first it was just an unexplained weakness and fatigue, accompanied by a slight fever and an increased irritability. But if the condition continued, after a few months, it would become increasingly more severe, as a sailor's gums would become sore and start to bleed, followed by tooth loss as well as agonizing headaches. The sailor's joints would then swell up and become painful and tender. Their eyesight would also deteriorate, their vision becoming blurred and sensitive to light. Then jaundice would set in, where the skin and eyes start to yellow, and soon after that, the victim would fall into a coma and die a short time later. But oddly, if they made it back to land and were given the chance to rest and recuperate, they would mysteriously make a full and speedy recovery. Such it was that a lot of sailors had the disease many times in their lives. At this stage, the commonly held view was that scurvy, as it was being called, was a digestive imbalance caused by the hardships of life at sea and the naval diet. Others believed it was caused by excess of black bile or laziness. The standard Royal Navy diet at the time lacked fresh meat, and the crew had to rely upon salted pork and beef for their protein, along with whatever fish and turtles they could catch. Their weekly ration during the 18th century consisted of 6 pounds of salted meat, which was the equivalent of the meat from 24 quarter-pound burgers. Along with this were small quantities of butter and cheese and a large amount of biscuit and oatmeal, totaling around 10 pounds. The biscuit was called hardtack and was inexpensive, being made from flour, water, and salt. Its major drawback was that it was tasteless and prone to bug infestations like weevils, a small, ugly, snout-nosed insect. There was also a daily pint of beer per man, along with a watered-down shot of rum. If times were tough, rats would be caught and eaten, which had the added bonus of keeping the onboard vermin population under control. But most importantly, fresh fruit and vegetables were only served for the first part of the voyage, as they would eventually spoil. So for most of these long trips, the sailors' diets completely lacked any source of vitamin C. So to try and cure scurvy, the Royal Navy introduced a number of measures, like increasing the beer ration, introducing the eating of sauerkraut, which was a fermented cabbage, and issuing a sugary drink made of malt and a thing called wort, which was a side product of the brewing process. None of these were particularly effective. In fact, one of these so-called cures was actually extremely dangerous to one's health. It was called the elixir of vitriol, consisting of sulfuric acid taken with alcoholic spirits that were infused with a mixture of various spices and mixed with barley water. Soon, this mysterious affliction was causing such a problem on long-distance voyages that the Royal Navy was forced to take action, because up to 50% of those sick with scurvy died in the beginning of the age of sail, and still 1 in 7 sick sailors died of it in the 18th century. Around this time, it was not just the fleets of the great European powers that were suffering from the ravages of scurvy. Pirates, who were a major world problem in those days, also suffered greatly. In some ways, pirates were hit even harder by scurvy, as they were limited by where they could pick up fresh supplies, as they were outlaws. To aid them was punishable by death. So they were often forced to rely on food supplies from the ships they plundered, which often meant their diet was even more deficient in vitamin C than the likes of the British or French navies. And to complicate matters further, pirate ships rarely carried any kind of doctor on board, so pirate ships often relied on good fortune when it came to injury or disease, and a man handy with a saw if it was time for an amputation. The famous pirate Blackbeard was unusual for his time and insisted on keeping a well-stocked medicine chest on board with a selection of herbs, assorted knives, razors, cauterizing irons, cupping glasses, stitching quill, and needles. Then, in 1747, a Scottish doctor named James Lind aboard the British warship HMS Salisbury, in his experiments, discovered a link between a sailor's poor diet at sea and the true cause of scurvy, and that it might be cured by eating fresh citrus fruit. But his findings were overshadowed by his work on clinical medical experiment methods and the importance of good hygiene, causing his work on scurvy to be overlooked. In 1793, the much-respected Rear Admiral Gardner insisted, after being advised by the physician Gilbert Blaine, that some of his ships heading on a 4-month voyage to India carry lemon juice to be issued every day to the crew. Gardner had seen firsthand how ineffective the so-called cures for scurvy were, but had been impressed by how the Spanish Navy was getting the problem under control by regular doses of lemon juice. There was much astonishment when his small fleet of ships arrived in India, and not a single crew member had gone down with scurvy the entire trip, something completely unheard of at the time on such a long voyage. The Royal Navy's Sick and Hurt Board quickly recommended to the British Admiralty that lemon juice be issued as a daily ration to the crews on all British warships in the future. Gilbert Blaine was appointed as the commissioner to the Sick and Hurt Board in 1795 and used his experience with the results Gardner had shown to persuade the Admiralty to issue lemon juice as a daily ration to the entire Royal Navy fleet. Almost overnight, scurvy became a thing of the past. In time, science identified that scurvy was not a disease or ailment, but in fact a deficiency in vitamin C caused by a lack of fresh fruit and vegetables.
Let's make up some burgoo. So this is going to be very, very simple. I've got some water boiling up here. I'm not even sure quite exactly how much, but probably about 4 or 5 cups. I'm going to add just a touch of salt, and it's likely on board ship they have all the salt they need, so they would add salt to this. Now you can imagine they're going to be cooking this in a giant copper vat because they have to cook food for even a small ship might have 50 or 60 men, a military ship. A frigate, 200 men, ship of the line, 400, 500, 600 men you're going to have to cook for. So we've got some oatmeal here that's already kind of ground up, and we're going to slowly add that and stir it. And the ratio on this is probably about 3 to 1 oatmeal to water. They might cook this up for a long time, let it get very, very thick. But you can imagine at other times they had to make this in a hurry, and it would be a thin gruel, depending on what their provisions were like, whether they were running low or not. So there's another term that shows up if you're reading about sailors' food, and that's loblolly, and that's actually an earlier term for the same thing. The same thing as burgoo. It really kind of means a frothing, bubbling, cooking mess, and so they would use that same term, and slowly over time they dropped that loblolly term, and burgoo became the name for the same thing. Okay, here's our burgoo. It's all done. I just added our molasses in there, and I mean, I can imagine that they might have used a blackstrap molasses, something with a lot of flavor that was very, very cheap for these sailors. I tried to use, I like baking molasses a little better than blackstrap, but that's it. It's really just oatmeal, water. We didn't use any milk. We didn't use any cream, and molasses boiled up. Let's find out how this burgoo turned out. Yeah, I can imagine, I can see all these sailors, they're all, at their tables, and they're eating up their, they're eating up their burgoo. It's good. It would keep you going. It would keep you energized for the day, and a very, very cheap ration. I'm not sure I can imagine it with a whole bunch of slush on it, you know, that grease and oil from the top of the cooking thing. But if you're an officer, maybe you've got a special version of Burgoo. You're gonna add a little nutmeg to it just to give it a wonderful flavor, right? So let's add a little nutmeg. We're gonna make our officer's version of Burgoo. Find out what that's gonna do to it. I'll bet you now it's gonna be something special. Even the smell of nutmeg adds something to it. Now there you go. That is a wonderful Burgoo.